On what began as an otherwise ordinary morning, a surprising lead from a local resident guided investigators to a quiet suburban neighborhood on the outskirts of Sydney. There, parked discreetly along the side of the road, was a gray Volkswagen Golf. Yet something about it caught the attention of authorities. The vehicle was locked, and a thin layer of condensation clouded the inside of the windows, suggesting it had been there for some time. Police officers approached cautiously, aware of the gravity the situation might hold. After cordoning off the area and carefully gaining access to the vehicle, their worst suspicions were confirmed. Inside the car was Dr. Preethi Reddy. The discovery was heartbreaking, marking a tragic end to days of painful uncertainty and desperate hope for her loved ones. While devastating, it at least offered closure to the family and began to shift the investigation from a search to seeking answers about what had truly happened. Dear viewers, thank you for choosing our video and our channel. We put a lot of effort into making sure you enjoy being with us. Preethi Reddy was born on the 19th of October, 1986, in the lively and fast-growing Indian city of Pimpri Chinchwad, located along the banks of the serene Pavana River in the state of Maharashtra. She was the firstborn child to Dr. Narasimha Reddy and Dr. Sharita Reddy, a highly respected couple known for their significant contributions to the local healthcare community. Thanks to their consistent success and dedication to their work, the family enjoyed a lifestyle marked by comfort, stability, and educational opportunity. From her earliest years, Preethi, often affectionately called Preeti by family and friends, displayed a sharp intellect and a warm, magnetic personality. Her younger sister, Nithya, born 4 years later, was her closest confidant and loyal companion. The two sisters shared an inseparable bond. Whether it was long conversations under the stars or whispered secrets before bedtime, their closeness was a pillar in both of their lives. Education was not only encouraged in the Reddy household, it was a non-negotiable priority. The girls were provided with the best academic resources available. They attended elite private institutions, participated in extracurricular activities, and were guided by their parents with discipline tempered by warmth. The Reddys were a close-knit family, and their home was filled with laughter, celebration, and shared dreams of a successful future. In 1996, when Preeti was just 10 years old, her parents made a bold and life-altering decision. In pursuit of expanded professional opportunities and a better future for their daughters, the Reddy family immigrated to Australia. They left behind extended family, friends, and their flourishing practice in India, settling in a peaceful, family-friendly suburb on the outskirts of Sydney. There, they bought a spacious, modern home, a fresh start, filled with ambition and new possibilities. The transition was not without its challenges, but Preeti adapted quickly to her new environment. With her outgoing nature, she made friends easily at her new school, a prestigious private academy where she stood out for her academic achievements and leadership qualities. She was articulate, compassionate, and had a natural ability to make those around her feel seen and valued. It came as no surprise when Preeti announced her intention to pursue a career in healthcare. Inspired by the example set by her parents, she chose the path of dentistry, a field that combined technical precision, science, and the opportunity to make a daily difference in people's lives. Upon completing her secondary education, however, Preeti made a decision that raised some eyebrows in her circle. Instead of continuing her education in Australia, she chose to return to India to attend a prestigious dental college in New Delhi. Her decision, while unexpected, was rooted in a desire to explore her roots, gain international perspective, and connect more deeply with the country where she was born. Her parents supported her unconditionally. They respected her independence and encouraged her to follow her intuition, even if it meant facing unfamiliar challenges far from home. Preeti thrived during her years in New Delhi. She was a diligent student, known for her meticulous approach to dental science, and she built a strong network of colleagues and mentors. After successfully completing her degree, she returned to Australia in 2019, rejoining her family and stepping confidently into her professional life. She began working at the Hurstville Dental and Physiotherapy Centre in Western Sydney, a well-regarded facility known for its commitment to comprehensive patient care. Simultaneously, she pursued advanced training at the Royal Dental Hospital in Melbourne, further refining her skills. Later, she became part of the team at Glenbrook Dental, a multidisciplinary clinic where she earned a reputation as a thoughtful and effective general practitioner. By this time, Dr. Preethi Reddy had become a name of quiet recognition in the dental community. Patients praised her gentle manner and thorough care, while colleagues admired her dedication to continuing education. Always striving to learn more, she enrolled in specialized courses focusing on dental implants, a technically complex and rapidly growing field. Her ultimate dream was to open her own state-of-the-art clinic in Melbourne, where she could serve a diverse community with top-tier dental care. However, behind her professional achievements and warm public persona, a more complicated and private chapter of her life was unfolding, one that would begin years earlier and slowly cast a shadow over her once bright and confident spirit. In 2013, during her residency at the Royal Dental Hospital in Melbourne, Preethi met a fellow dental student named Harsh Nard, known among friends by the nickname Harshi. Like Preethi, Harshi came from a family of healthcare professionals, and he too had chosen the path of dentistry. At first glance, they appeared to be a well-matched pair, ambitious, educated, and culturally aligned. Their shared professional interests and similar backgrounds drew them together quickly, and what began as friendly conversations during shifts soon evolved into a romantic relationship. Yet as the weeks turned into months, it became evident that not all was as it seemed. Those close to Preethi began to notice subtle but troubling changes in her demeanor. Harshi, while outwardly charming, had a possessive side that often veered into controlling behavior. He was known to be moody, and over time, his criticisms of Preethi became more frequent, undermining her self-esteem. He questioned her decisions, her friendships, and even her clothing choices. What started as a seemingly supportive relationship began to erode her confidence. Nithya, always attuned to her sister's emotional state, was the first to raise concerns. Although she was aware that Preethi was seeing someone, she found it strange that her sister avoided discussing the relationship in any detail. Harshi was never introduced to the family. He never came to their home, and whenever his name came up, Preethi would quickly change the subject or downplay the seriousness of their relationship. At the same time, Preethi's behavior shifted. She grew quieter, more withdrawn. Her once joyful energy seemed dulled, replaced by a sense of caution, even anxiety. Friends described her as distracted, often nervous during phone calls, and rarely available for social outings. Her parents, sensing something was wrong, asked repeatedly to meet the man she was involved with, but their daughter remained evasive. The subject was often avoided altogether. Harshi lived a relatively quiet life in Tamworth, a town nestled in the rolling hills of New South Wales. He was employed as a dental technician at a modest local clinic and often spent his evenings alone in his apartment. Harshi often pressed her to move to Tamworth and share a home with him, pushing the idea under the guise of building a real future. But for Preethi, something deep within her, a quiet intuition she couldn't ignore, held her back. She gently refused, again and again. There was no single reason she could articulate, but a consistent unease lingered in her heart, warning her that something was off. For the first 6 months of their relationship, Preethi chose to keep it under wraps. She didn't mention it to her family, nor did she bring it up with her close friends. It wasn't until much later that she shared the details with a small circle of confidants. Her sister Nithya met Harshi on a few occasions and instantly felt a wave of discomfort. She later described his demeanor as unsettling, his presence oddly cold, as though he were performing a version of himself rather than being genuine. Her instincts, it would turn out, were astute. By 2014, the two were seen together more openly. Their relationship was no longer a secret, at least to those within their social spheres. However, a notable boundary remained. Preethi never introduced Harshi to her parents, and she tactfully avoided meeting his family as well. The distance she maintained wasn't accidental. It was a conscious choice, one rooted in caution and a lack of full trust. Not long after making their relationship semi-public, they broke up. It wasn't a dramatic or public split. Preethi simply chose to move on quietly, not broadcasting the end to even her closest allies. This would become a familiar pattern. Over the years, their relationship turned into a cycle of breakups and reconciliations. Preethi often kept the changes to herself, sometimes not even informing her closest friends whether they were together or not. The back and forth was draining, filled with emotional turbulence, Intense disagreements followed by deeply emotional makeups that left her feeling disoriented and uncertain. It became a secret she carried with growing embarrassment, as though she were ashamed of her inability to break free for good. Throughout it all, Harshi's criticisms grew more pointed. He frequently told Preethi that she wasn't committed enough, that she needed to prove her dedication by uprooting her life and moving to Tamworth. In the autumn of 2016, another breakup occurred. This time, one that felt more final. Preethi hoped that she had finally reached the end of the exhausting cycle. She was ready to prioritize her peace and reclaim her independence. Harshi, however, was not prepared to let go. October approached, and with it, Preethi's 30th birthday. Unknown to her, Harshi had been secretly planning a surprise celebration in an attempt to win her back. An elaborate gesture meant to reignite what he believed was still there between them. But Preethi had already made other plans. She had organized a small party at her parents' home in Sydney, inviting only close friends and family. Notably, Harshi was not on the guest list. Despite the unambiguous message this sent, Harshi did not relent. He continued reaching out to her, making emotional appeals and promising that things would be different. Though he had never crossed the line into physical aggression, his repeated pleas and emotionally charged messages wore her down over time. The pressure was unrelenting. He would often express how much he was struggling, framing her decision to move on as the root cause of his emotional pain. Eventually, perhaps out of lingering affection, guilt, or simply exhaustion, Preethi gave him one final chance. She allowed herself to hope that maybe, with time, things could change. That the version of Harshi she once cared about might return. But within weeks, it became painfully clear that the relationship was beyond repair. The old patterns quickly re-emerged, and she felt the weight of her decisions settle like a stone in her chest. By 2018, Preethi reached a place of clarity. After one last attempt to reconcile, she finally accepted that no amount of compromise on her part would ever be enough to build a stable or fulfilling future with Harshi. That fall, she ended the relationship once and for all, this time with full conviction. Only weeks later, life took a new and hopeful turn. At a professional networking event in Sydney, she met a young physician from Melbourne. Their connection was immediate and deeply sincere. He was calm, compassionate, and thoughtful. Everything Harshi had never been. With him, Preethi felt seen and valued. She didn't hesitate to share her joy with those closest to her. For the first time in many years, she wasn't hiding. Their relationship blossomed rapidly. She introduced him to her family, who embraced him warmly, and her friends remarked on how genuinely happy and relaxed she seemed in his presence. The future she had once feared might never come now seemed not only possible but within reach. They spoke openly about their dreams, marriage, children, and building a shared life. Preethi even began planning a move to Melbourne to be closer to him, applying for new positions at respected dental clinics. To her delight, she received several offers and accepted one that excited her deeply. In December, she confided in her friends that she finally felt free of the past. Her voice, once hesitant when speaking of love, now carried a lightness they hadn't heard in years. But that peace would not last. In January, Harshi became aware of her new relationship. Unable to accept her happiness without him, he began reaching out once again, calling, texting, and trying to arrange meetings under various pretenses. His messages carried a tone of desperation, cloaked in emotional appeals and veiled guilt-tripping. By February, the situation escalated. During a private conversation with his brother, Harshi expressed a disturbing inability to let go. He spoke not just of heartbreak, but of betrayal, framing Preethi's decision to move on as a personal affront. He said he couldn't accept the idea of her building a life with someone else, and hinted that he was willing to take drastic action. At the time, his words had seemed like little more than bitter echoes. Emotional outbursts said in passing, clouded by the sting of rejection and the frustration of a relationship that had long since unraveled. Preethi Reddy didn't believe he meant them, not in any serious way. So, when Harsh Narde spoke of not being able to accept her moving on, she dismissed it as more of the same. Talk, not action. But what began as discomfort would quietly evolve into something far more concerning. On March 1st, 2019, Sydney played host to a prestigious international dental conference. The two-day event was attended by hundreds of professionals from across the globe, all gathered to discuss emerging techniques and innovations in modern dentistry. Among them was Dr. Preethi Reddy, a respected and rising talent in her field, and coincidentally her former partner, Dr. Harsh Nard. Preethi was excited about the event, not just because of the opportunity to learn, but also for the chance to reconnect with peers and mentors. She had booked a room at the Urban Hotel where the conference was being held and was sharing it with two close friends and colleagues. It was meant to be both a professional weekend and a fun getaway. Harshi, however, had chosen different accommodations, staying at the Swiss Hotel just a few blocks away. From the very first morning, an unease began to settle in. Harshi's presence at the conference was anything but subtle. Throughout the day, Preethi noticed him watching her, not just in passing glances, but intently, sometimes even following her between sessions. He didn't approach her directly at first, but the weight of his gaze was enough to make her visibly uncomfortable. When she mentioned it to her friends during lunch, they reassured her that she didn't owe him anything. But by the end of the day, her unease had only intensified. That night, she and her friends decided to unwind at a nearby nightclub. Preethi, usually someone who could let her guard down in the right company, seemed distracted. Her eyes kept darting around the room. She smiled. She danced, but always with one eye on the door. At one point, she admitted she feared Harshi might follow them there. Though he never showed up, the anxiety lingered. The second day of the conference offered no reprieve. Harshi seemed to be everywhere she went. He intercepted her between sessions, insisted on speaking with her, and even waited outside one of her workshops. Her friends urged her not to engage, not out of hostility, but out of concern. They had witnessed firsthand the toll the relationship had taken on her over the years and knew this situation was far from ordinary. But Preethi, always striving to be understanding, felt conflicted. A part of her still hoped for closure, some clean and final conversation that would allow her to move on without guilt. So, after the conference concluded, she agreed to speak with him. The decision wasn't made lightly. She had rehearsed what she would say, carefully choosing words that were firm but respectful. She hoped, perhaps naively, that he would accept what was and finally give her space to breathe. At approximately 6:30 p.m. on March 2, hotel security cameras captured footage of a gray Volkswagen Golf exiting the Urban Hotel's underground garage. Behind the wheel was Preethi. Harshi was seated in the passenger seat beside her. Just under an hour later, the car was seen pulling up at a refined eatery known as Raviskant, a restaurant popular among locals and visitors alike for its serene ambiance and upscale menu. The two walked in together. Several patrons and staff members who later spoke to authorities recalled the atmosphere at their table. There was a visible strain between them. Preethi looked tense, often glancing down at her hands or out the window. Harshi, by contrast, leaned forward frequently, gesturing passionately and attempting to hold her hand despite her resistance. One waiter later recounted that during a lull in service, he overheard part of their conversation. Preethi had gently told Harshi that she had moved on, that she was in a relationship with someone new, someone who made her feel safe and loved. She mentioned her plans to relocate to Melbourne, to start fresh. Her voice was calm but resolute. Harshi, however, didn't seem ready to let go. He talked about the future, about getting married, about making sacrifices to be with her. His response didn't acknowledge her feelings. It dismissed them, as if he were trying to rewrite the narrative entirely. By around 10:30 p.m., the two left the restaurant and walked toward the parked car. They didn't get in immediately. Surveillance footage showed them standing by the vehicle, talking, or rather arguing, for more than an hour. Harshi attempted to embrace her. She declined, stepping back, clearly shaken. At around midnight, the car finally drove away. They drove through the city for another 15 minutes, eventually pulling into a quiet mall parking lot. No one exited the vehicle. Security cameras mounted to the structure recorded their silhouettes in the front seats. Though no audio was available, the footage clearly showed Harshi's animated movements. He was gesturing forcefully while Preethi sat still, her face turned toward the window. At 2 a.m., Preethi exited the car and entered a 24-hour fast food outlet inside the mall. She bought a bottle of water and remained inside near the entrance for several minutes. Employees later said she seemed uncertain, as if she were waiting, maybe for a cab, maybe for him to drive away. But when she returned to the lot, Harshi was still in the car. The two then drove to the Swiss hotel where Harshi had his room. They entered the lobby silently, not exchanging a word with the front desk. Hotel staff noted Preethi's subdued demeanor, describing her as quiet, almost distant. Harshi guided her toward the elevators and into his suite. That was around 3 a.m. Preethi was not seen leaving the room after that. Later that morning, March 3rd, around 10 a.m., Preethi made a call to her sister, Nithya. She sounded relaxed and assured her she'd be home in a few hours. Just minutes later, she placed a call to Harshi, reportedly telling him she loved him and that they would soon be together. That conversation, seemingly contradictory to everything that had transpired, would raise questions later. But for now, it was the last confirmed communication anyone had from her. When Preethi didn't return home that afternoon, concern quickly turned into worry. She was known for her punctuality and her habit of staying in touch, especially with her family. Her phone was turned off, a rare and troubling detail. By mid-afternoon, her family began calling her friends and colleagues. No one had heard from her. No one had seen her since the conference. As evening crept in, worry became panic. In their search for answers, Preethi's loved ones learned of her dinner with Harshi and the increasingly insistent behavior he had shown over the course of the weekend. Her sister, Nithya, immediately tried calling him, but he didn't pick up. As the evening of March 3rd descended into nightfall, the Reddy family's concern turned into active alarm. Preethi had not returned any messages, hadn't made contact, and hadn't come home as promised. Her phone remained switched off. By 9 p.m., the family reached a breaking point. They walked into the nearest police station and officially filed a missing person report. In their account to authorities, they made no effort to hide their growing suspicion. They believed Preethi's ex-boyfriend, Harshi Nard, might be connected to her disappearance. They explained the turbulent history between the two, the recent encounter at the dental conference, and the strange emotional dynamics that had resurfaced. While the official process of the investigation began, the Reddy family launched their own urgent search effort. Every member of the family sprang into action, contacting anyone who might have interacted with Preethi in the days leading up to her vanishing. Friends, co-workers, mentors, former classmates, no one was off the list. Simultaneously, Preethi's younger sister, Nithya, turned to social media, posting recent photos of her sister, along with a heartfelt plea for help. She included a description of Preethi's appearance, her last known whereabouts, and a request for anyone with information, however small, to come forward. The digital ripple effect was swift. Within just 24 hours, the post had circulated far and wide, reaching nearly 2,000 people, including some of Preethi's former patients and dental colleagues across Australia. The community's response was overwhelming. Messages of support poured in. Dozens of individuals offered to assist in the search, while others reshared the post, amplifying its reach. And yet, for all the goodwill and concern, no one had any concrete information to offer. No verified sightings, no messages, no clues. The only person who remained disturbingly absent from all conversations was Harshi. By the afternoon of March 4th, Nithya finally managed to get Harshi to answer one of her calls. His demeanor on the other end of the line was shockingly indifferent. He spoke in a flat, almost dismissive tone, brushing off the growing panic. "Preethi's an adult," he said. "She'll show up. Maybe she just needs some space." He admitted that he'd seen her at the conference, but insisted their interaction had been minimal. Nothing more than a few polite words exchanged before they went their separate ways. But strangely, just an hour after that call, Harshi phoned Nithya back. This time, the tone had shifted entirely. Gone was the detached calm. In its place was fury. He shouted at her, angry that she had contacted his friends, colleagues, and even extended family, asking questions about his whereabouts and his interactions with Preethi. He accused the Reddy family of spreading baseless rumors and trying to ruin his name. What stood out, what truly raised red flags, was how little the spoke of Preethi herself. Not once did he express genuine concern for her well-being. Not once did he ask if there had been any new leads. Instead, his focus was entirely on how the situation reflected on him, his image, his reputation, and his sense of control. As more details came to light, police learned that Preethi had indeed met Harshi for dinner on the night of March 2nd. That positioned him as likely the last known person to see her before she vanished. Her family strongly urged him to give a full statement to the police, even before authorities formally required it. Later that day, Harshi showed up at a Sydney police station. He claimed he wanted to cooperate, that he had nothing to hide. But from the moment he walked through the doors, officers were struck by his erratic behavior. He was perspiring heavily, pacing the room, unable to sit still. His hands trembled slightly as he spoke. When asked to recount events, he shared that he had met with Preethi on March 2nd for dinner, described the conversation as closure, and claimed they had parted on peaceful terms. According to him, he had called a cab for her and watched her leave. However, when investigators pressed him to repeat his account, inconsistencies quickly emerged. His timeline was disjointed, with critical gaps and contradictions. In one version, they talked for an hour. In another, they barely spoke. He seemed unsure of basic facts: what they ate, who paid, what time they left. These weren't the slip-ups of someone grieving or concerned. They were the signs of a story being revised in real time. Still, the police had no physical evidence connecting him to a crime. There were no eyewitnesses, no forensic traces, no phone records that definitively placed him with Preethi at the time of her disappearance. As a result, despite the suspicious behavior, Harshi was allowed to leave the station. But just before he walked out, a detective made a casual remark, one that would prove pivotal. "We're pulling the surveillance tapes," he said. "The hotel, the restaurant, the parking garages. We'll have a pretty good timeline soon." That sentence struck a nerve. A few hours later, Harshi returned to the police station, unprompted. This time, he changed his story. He now admitted he had not called a cab for Preethi. She had, in fact, driven herself in her own car, the gray Volkswagen Golf captured on hotel surveillance. When asked why he lied earlier, he mumbled something about panic and being overwhelmed. He insisted the detail wasn't important, but officers knew otherwise. The change was crucial. It placed him alone with Preethi in her vehicle after an emotionally charged evening. Later that same evening, a separate news story broke. A tragic collision had occurred on the New England highway. According to early reports, a black BMW had crossed into the opposite lane at extremely high speed and crashed head-on with a large transport truck. The collision was devastating. The driver of the BMW was pronounced dead at the scene. First responders noted that it didn't appear to be an accident. The trajectory, the speed, the lack of braking, all pointed to intentionality. Within hours, the driver was formally identified. It was Dr. Harsh Nard. As authorities began piecing together the circumstances of the crash, they reviewed surveillance from traffic cameras near the highway. The footage confirmed their suspicions. Harshi had accelerated rapidly, with no attempt to swerve or slow down. The incident, while tragic, appeared to be deliberate. Investigators then re-examined the events leading up to the collision. Harshi had been visibly shaken after his police interview. The detective's mention of surveillance footage had clearly rattled him. It is believed he realized then and there that the full truth of the evening would soon be uncovered, that investigators would know exactly where he and Preethi had gone, what time they arrived at the hotel, and that she had entered his suite and was never seen leaving. The day after his passing, a tip from a local resident led investigators to a quiet residential area on the fringes of Sydney. Parked inconspicuously along the curb was a gray Volkswagen Golf. The car was locked, and its windows partially fogged from the inside. Police approached with caution. After securing the scene and opening the vehicle, they confirmed what they had feared. Inside was Dr. Preethi Reddy. The discovery, while devastating, brought an end to the uncertainty that had tormented her family for days. Through a meticulous review of hotel security footage, witness interviews, and timestamped transactions, authorities began to piece together the sequence of events surrounding Preethi's final known movements. What emerged was a story both devastating and chilling. A sequence that, once assembled, left little room for doubt. On the evening of March 2nd, Preethi had agreed to meet her former partner, Harshi Nard, for dinner. According to those closest to her, her decision was made reluctantly. After dinner, instead of parting ways, the two got back into Preethi's car, a gray Volkswagen Golf, and drove aimlessly through the city. Surveillance footage from multiple intersections and parking garages showed the vehicle circling through various areas, suggesting an unsettled conversation was continuing. For reasons investigators still speculate about, the car eventually pulled into the underground garage of the Swiss hotel where Harshi was staying. This was the last place Preethi was definitively seen. From that point onward, there was no footage of her leaving the building. Investigators believe that at some point, likely in the early hours of March 3rd, Preethi stepped into the bathroom of the hotel suite and attempted to contact her new partner. This call, possibly a moment of emotional relief or support, was never logged as completed. It's believed that Harshi, overhearing her side of the conversation, may have reacted impulsively and irrationally. Investigators theorize that this moment, already charged with emotion, triggered something in him, a breaking point that shattered any remaining restraint. What followed, though not publicly detailed by authorities, has been reconstructed from circumstantial evidence, forensic analysis, and the movements Harshi made in the hours that followed. In the morning, instead of contacting authorities, seeking help, or alerting anyone, Harshi proceeded with calculated, methodical steps. Surveillance footage and receipts confirmed his purchases. A large, hard-shell blue suitcase, multiple cleaning products, and a pair of gloves. By 5 p.m. that same day, Harshi officially checked out of his hotel room. Staff reported nothing unusual about his behavior. He wheeled the suitcase behind him and exited the lobby without incident. Outside, he approached Preethi's Volkswagen Golf, still parked in the hotel garage, and began loading items into the back. Security footage captured the entire process. With quiet precision, he got behind the wheel and drove toward the outer suburbs of Sydney. He eventually arrived in a quiet residential neighborhood far removed from the city's bustle. It was the sort of area where a vehicle left parked wouldn't immediately raise suspicion. There, tucked into a shadowy corner along the curb, he abandoned the vehicle, assuming, or perhaps hoping, it would remain unnoticed for several days. From there, Harshi retrieved his own car, a black BMW, and began the drive back toward Tamworth. By this point, he may have believed he had executed the perfect disappearance. He likely believed he could outmaneuver the investigation. Even if police questioned him, he thought they wouldn't be able to prove anything beyond speculation. What Harshi failed to anticipate was the extent of digital and physical surveillance embedded in modern urban life. As Giovanni approached the store, he glanced through one of the front windows and immediately noticed movement inside. Something or someone was there. Sensing trouble, he stepped inside. The scene that greeted him was unsettling. The store was in complete disarray. Video game cases were strewn across the floor, display shelves were disturbed, and the cash register drawer was open with loose bills sitting haphazardly around it. Giovanni's concern grew into alarm. He headed straight to the back, toward the manager's office, a secure area where the store kept its cash safe. When he pushed open the office door, he froze. What he saw inside stopped him cold. Without wasting a second, Giovanni pulled out his phone and called the police. Officers arrived within minutes. They quickly secured the premises and began their investigation. After a brief examination of the office, they confirmed what Giovanni had feared. The person found inside was Amber Belulin. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. Amber Belulin entered the world on December 6, 1981, in the warm, bustling city of San Antonio, Texas. From early childhood, Amber displayed a deep and genuine love for animals. This wasn't just a passing phase. It became a central part of her identity. With such a compassionate nature and strong sense of responsibility, It was no surprise that Amber's dream was to become a veterinarian. She held on to that goal for years, often telling friends and teachers how she planned to work with animals for the rest of her life. After graduating from high school, she was fully intent on pursuing that path. However, knowing that education would be expensive and not wanting to burden her family financially, Amber decided to delay college temporarily and instead focus on earning some money first. She found a job at a local video game store, one that catered to casual and dedicated gamers alike. What started as a temporary gig quickly turned into something more serious. Amber's work ethic and upbeat attitude made a strong impression. She was dependable, punctual, and exceptionally organized, qualities that quickly set her apart. Within a relatively short time, she earned a promotion to store manager. Her coworkers respected her, and customers appreciated her friendly and helpful demeanor. Amber stayed in that managerial position for about 3 years. By 2007, when she was 25, she felt ready to take the next step toward her original dream. That year, she enrolled in veterinary courses at a local college, excited to finally pursue her passion for animal care. Life was beginning to align with the vision she had carried since she was a child. But everything changed on the morning of January 29th. Amber was scheduled to open the store that day, just like she did almost every morning. As manager, she typically arrived first to unlock the doors, get the registers ready, and prepare for the day. However, on this particular morning, something was off. She didn't arrive on time, which was highly unusual for someone known for her reliability. As the hours passed with no sign of Amber, people began to grow concerned. The corporate office noticed that the store hadn't opened and began trying to reach her. They called her personal phone several times, but there was no answer. They even dialed the store's landline, thinking she might have gone inside and forgotten her cell. Still, there was no response. Unnerved by the silence, the company contacted a nearby store location and asked if someone could swing by to see what was going on. An employee named Giovanni volunteered to check it out. When he arrived, the exterior of the store looked completely undisturbed. The lights were off, the doors were locked, and nothing appeared visibly wrong. Giovanni walked around the building, peered into the windows, and even gently knocked on the glass, but there was no movement inside. It simply looked like the store had not yet opened for the day. He called corporate to report what he saw and returned to his own store. Still unable to reach Amber and now growing more concerned, corporate placed another call to Giovanni around noon, requesting that he go back for a second look. This time, when he returned, things took a strange turn. As before, the doors were locked and the lights were off, but something was different. When Giovanni peered through one of the front windows, he noticed someone moving inside. That person turned out to be another employee, Brandon, who was already inside the building. Brandon unlocked the door and let Giovanni in. Immediately upon entering, Giovanni could tell something wasn't right. The store was in complete disarray. Video game cases were strewn across the floor, display shelves were disturbed, and the cash register drawer was open with loose bills sitting haphazardly around it. At first glance, it looked like a robbery had taken place. Yet Brandon didn't seem to be reacting to the scene around him. He was calm, almost indifferent, which struck Giovanni as extremely odd given the condition of the store. Concerned, Giovanni made his way to the manager's office in the back. It was a place where money was kept in a secure safe. When he opened the office door, what he saw caused him to freeze in place. Without hesitation, he contacted the local authorities. Police officers arrived within minutes, quickly securing the building and beginning their investigation. It wasn't long before they confirmed that the individual found in the office was indeed Amber Belulin. She had come to work that morning as usual, but something had gone terribly wrong. Inside the office, the safe was completely empty, cleaned out. The cash register out front had also been emptied, but oddly, some bills had been left behind, as if the theft had been rushed or incomplete. Outside, Amber's car remained parked where she had left it, right in front of the store. The doors were unlocked, and her cell phone was left on the front seat, untouched. That detail raised new questions. Why would she leave such important belongings unsecured? One particularly troubling detail stood out. When Giovanni had arrived earlier that morning, the store had been fully locked and dark. How then did someone manage to commit the crime and exit the premises, locking the doors behind them? Investigators began carefully reviewing the locks, entry points, and surveillance footage from nearby businesses to piece together a timeline. With the help of employees, detectives determined that more than just money was missing. An inventory check revealed that approximately 50 video game discs, an Xbox console, and several PlayStation units had been taken as well. The total value of the stolen items was estimated to be around $6,000. As the investigation moved forward, police interviewed Amber's co-workers, hoping to understand more about her schedule and routine. They learned that Amber typically arrived at the store around 9 a.m., an hour before opening. Her usual tasks included unlocking the door, retrieving the previous day's cash from the safe, and then making a quick trip to the bank before starting store preparations. Based on that timeline, detectives believed she had arrived at the store right on schedule on the morning of January 29th. Shortly after entering the store, investigators believed she had been confronted. The details of what happened next remained unclear, but the working theory was that the assailant acted swiftly, possibly knowing her routine. A few days into the investigation, detectives received another lead. The manager of a different store in the same retail chain came forward and mentioned that he had spoken with Amber on the phone that morning. Their call took place just a few minutes after Amber would have arrived at the store. It was brief and didn't seem out of the ordinary at the time. And then Amber suddenly said she had to go. And with that, the phone call ended. The words were abrupt, almost rushed, leaving the person on the other end with a strange feeling. As law enforcement officials began piecing together what happened that morning, a troubling pattern began to emerge. What initially looked like a straightforward robbery was quickly beginning to seem far more complicated and far more personal. For starters, investigators discovered that Amber had apparently opened both the cash register and the safe herself. That changed everything. If the person responsible had access to the money without needing to force anything open, it meant there may not have been a confrontation about the cash at all. Amber may have cooperated, possibly without realizing the threat. That detail raised a critical question. If money wasn't the true motive, then what was? Detectives also began taking a closer look at the store's layout. One feature stood out: the back door. It opened into a service alley that connected to multiple other businesses, and each of them had nearly identical entrances. To someone unfamiliar with the property, the back door would have looked just like the rest. But if someone used it to get inside, they would have needed prior knowledge of which door led to the video game store specifically. That suggested something crucial. The person responsible might have either worked there or been very familiar with the building. As the list of unusual details grew longer, detectives began leaning toward a new theory. Maybe this hadn't been a spontaneous act at all. Maybe it was something more calculated, something with deeper roots. The idea of a random robbery was starting to lose ground. It now seemed entirely possible that the scene had been staged, designed to throw investigators off track. What they were actually dealing with, they now suspected, might have been a planned act with a targeted victim. And the cash and stolen electronics were simply a distraction. Unfortunately, the investigation ran into one serious obstacle early on: the lack of physical evidence. Unlike other stores in the same retail chain, this location didn't have a single security camera inside. That meant there was no footage to review, no time-stamped records of who entered or exited the store, and no way to track what happened in those crucial early morning hours. Crime scene technicians combed the location meticulously, hoping to find fingerprints, footprints, DNA, or any other physical trace that might provide a lead. But despite their efforts, nothing of investigative value was recovered. No fingerprints on the bag, no biological evidence, no signs of forced entry. It was a clean scene, almost too clean, which only deepened the mystery. Even without forensic evidence, investigators were not working in the dark. By the time they had finished reviewing the timeline and accounts from Amber's co-workers, one name had already come up more than once: Brandon. If that name sounds familiar, it's because Brandon was the employee Giovanni encountered during his second visit to the store. The man seen standing inside while the lights remained off and the doors were still locked. That alone was odd, but his behavior made things even more suspicious. According to Giovanni, Brandon didn't act startled or concerned by the store's disarray. Instead, he seemed unaffected, almost as if he didn't notice anything wrong at all. The cash drawer was open, merchandise was scattered everywhere, and yet Brandon gave no indication that any of it surprised him. When questioned by police, Brandon claimed that he had arrived for his scheduled shift only minutes before Giovanni walked in. He told investigators that upon finding the store dark and locked, he thought maybe his schedule had been mixed up. Maybe it was his turn to open and he'd simply forgotten. So, using his key, he let himself in. Once inside, he said he saw the mess but didn't think much of it. He assumed someone had left the store in a rush the night before and that he was now going to get blamed for the chaos. That, he said, was his only concern. Brandon also told police that he had not gone anywhere near the manager's office and therefore had no idea Amber was in there. He said he hadn't seen her that day and had no clue anything serious had occurred. But police weren't convinced. Brandon was someone who knew the store inside and out. He understood the building's layout, knew which doors had locks, which ones didn't, and was aware there were no cameras inside to capture what anyone did. He also had something else. A possible reason for wanting Amber gone. As the investigation progressed, detectives spoke with Amber's family, as well as other employees who had worked closely with her. Several of them confirmed that Amber had mentioned Brandon before, and not in a positive light. As her assistant manager, Brandon was often accused of being careless on the job. Amber reportedly complained about him multiple times, saying he neglected his responsibilities, arrived late, and didn't take the work seriously. The situation had reached a breaking point. Amber was fed up, and according to those closest to her, she had finally decided to take formal action. She had written up an official complaint and was planning to submit it to upper management. That complaint, as it turns out, was supposed to be sent the very morning Amber lost her life. That detail changed everything. It gave Brandon not just opportunity, but a clear motive. If the complaint went through, he might have lost his job, or at the very least, faced disciplinary action. And yet, even with motive and opportunity, police still had no concrete proof connecting him to the scene. In an effort to find that missing link, detectives secured a warrant to search Brandon's apartment, vehicle, and cell phone records. They were hoping to uncover evidence of the missing merchandise. Nearly 50 video game discs and several high-value consoles had been stolen from the store. But much to their frustration, they found nothing. No hidden stash of games, no consoles tucked away, no receipts indicating quick resale. Everything came up empty. Then came another surprise. Brandon's cell phone data told a different story than expected. According to records from his mobile provider, Brandon was not even near the store at the time of the incident. The data placed his phone at a completely different location until close to 2 p.m., hours after police believed Amber had arrived and been confronted around 9 a.m. Even more complicating, Brandon had an alibi. He told investigators he had spent that morning helping his fiancée and her parents with moving and errands. When police followed up, they confirmed the story. His fiancée and her family all backed him up without hesitation. They remembered the morning clearly and insisted Brandon had been with them the entire time. Despite this, detectives didn't rule him out. They continued pressing his timeline, rechecking his alibi, and exploring any possible gaps that could have allowed him to slip away unnoticed. They reviewed surveillance footage from neighboring businesses and even re-examined the back alley, hoping to find a clue that might support or disprove his story. During this time, Amber's funeral took place. It was a somber event, filled with friends, family, and co-workers all grieving the sudden loss of a vibrant young woman who had touched many lives. But in a moment that shocked everyone, Brandon showed up. His presence at the service was met with quiet disbelief. By then, nearly everyone close to Amber had heard he was the main suspect. For her loved ones, seeing him there felt deeply unsettling. Some interpreted it as bold. Others saw it as disrespectful. But Brandon said little, paid his respects quietly, and left. Eventually, though, police were forced to acknowledge the facts. His alibi held up, his phone records backed it, and no evidence, physical or digital, tied him to the crime scene. So, reluctantly, investigators moved on, even though a few lingering doubts still shadowed their decision. With Brandon no longer at the center of the investigation, police began to re-examine other people in Amber's life. Naturally, their focus turned toward her boyfriend at the time, a man named Fred. Just minutes before the timeline suggested Amber was attacked, she had sent Fred a brief but emotionally charged message. "Love you." It was short, sweet, and appeared to be part of an ordinary exchange. But given the tragic events that followed, it took on a more haunting tone. Investigators brought Fred in for questioning, combing through his movements, communications, and any connections he might have had to Amber's workplace. But much like Brandon, Fred had a solid alibi that could not be poked full of holes. Multiple people confirmed his whereabouts that morning, and none of the digital footprints, texts, calls, location data suggested he had anything to do with the incident. So once again, police found themselves back at the beginning, staring into the uncertainty of an unsolved case with no prime suspect in sight. In an effort to keep the case from slipping away into silence, detectives held a public press conference alongside Amber's grieving parents. The goal was to generate renewed interest and potentially shake loose a vital tip. As part of the announcement, a massive reward was offered, $100,000 for any information leading to an arrest. Most of the reward money was contributed by the company that owned the store where Amber had worked, a gesture of support that also underlined the seriousness with which they were taking the tragedy. In the days that followed, the phone lines began to light up. Calls came in from people who thought they saw something suspicious, heard a rumor, or knew someone acting strangely around the time of the incident. Each tip was followed up, investigated thoroughly. But despite the volume of leads, none of them brought investigators any closer to the truth. One by one, they were eliminated. Dead ends that left detectives with more frustration than answers. As weeks turned into months, the urgency slowly began to fade, replaced by a cold stillness that often surrounds unsolved cases. The file remained open, but progress stalled. It was a painful, uncertain chapter not only for Amber's loved ones, but also for the investigators who had poured their time and energy into finding answers. The prospect of justice began to feel distant, even improbable. But then, 7 months after Amber's death, the case took a sudden and entirely unexpected turn. The call came in quietly. No fanfare, no dramatic confession. A man reached out to authorities and asked to remain anonymous. He told them he had some information about Amber's case, though he was hesitant and guarded at first. His voice carried the weight of someone who had been holding on to something heavy for a long time. The detectives listened carefully, urging him to take his time. Eventually, the man agreed to meet with them in person to share what he knew. During the conversation, the anonymous tipster revealed that on the day before Amber was killed, he had been approached by a friend with a shocking suggestion. According to him, the friend had proposed that they rob a store. An easy job, he had called it. The plan was supposedly simple, with low risk and a good payout. The man said he declined the offer. He didn't want to get involved. But the next morning, when he saw the news about Amber's murder, a terrible realization struck him. He believed he knew exactly who was behind it. The friend who had suggested the robbery worked at the same retail chain. But it wasn't Brandon. It was Giovanni. Yes, the same Giovanni who had been sent by corporate to check on the store the morning Amber failed to show up. The same person who had entered the darkened store later that day and discovered Brandon inside, claiming he'd just arrived for his shift. The man said that the day after Amber was killed, he met up with Giovanni again. During their conversation, Giovanni allegedly made a shocking statement, one that the witness said he would never forget. According to the tipster, Giovanni confessed. The man claimed that Giovanni outright admitted to being responsible for Amber's death. He didn't give specifics, but the implication was clear. The man said he had been completely stunned, paralyzed by fear, unsure what to do next. He didn't go to the police at the time because he was terrified, convinced that if he spoke up, Giovanni might come after him too. That fear kept him silent for months, but the guilt eventually became too much to bear. What made the story even more credible was that the witness wasn't a stranger to Amber or Giovanni. He had worked with both of them at the same store in the past. He knew the building, the routines, and the people involved. And that knowledge lent weight to what he was saying. Giovanni, after all, would have known there were no security cameras at that store location. He would have known that Amber, seeing him at the door, wouldn't hesitate to let him in. They were co-workers. She trusted him. With this new information, police moved quickly. Giovanni was brought in for questioning. But when detectives sat him down and laid out the allegations, he denied everything. He said he had nothing to do with Amber's death and insisted he had nothing to hide. No matter how long the interview went on or how many different angles they tried, Giovanni didn't budge. He stuck to his story. He was innocent. Without physical evidence to contradict him, there was only so much investigators could do. Despite the witness's testimony, the district attorney wasn't convinced it would be enough to bring charges. In a courtroom, the standard is high, beyond a reasonable doubt. Without tangible proof, getting a jury to convict would be an uphill battle. Still, detectives weren't ready to let the case go cold again. As a final move, they obtained a warrant to collect a DNA sample from Giovanni. They hoped that the pressure alone, just asking for the sample, might rattle him. Even though no viable biological evidence had been recovered from the crime scene, they believed the request might shake his composure. Giovanni complied with the warrant. He handed over the DNA sample but didn't break his stride. He maintained his innocence and cooperated calmly. But the very next day, something unexpected happened. Police received word that Giovanni had suddenly left town. Without much notice, he had packed up and relocated his entire family to Laredo, a city right on the Texas-Mexico border. The move raised immediate red flags for detectives. To them, it looked suspicious, possibly even strategic. Laredo's proximity to the border made it a potential launching point for disappearing altogether, and the sudden relocation suggested Giovanni might be trying to put distance between himself and the investigation. Unfortunately, even this wasn't enough to act on. There were no warrants, no indictments, and still no hard evidence. The law requires more than suspicion to detain someone, and once again, detectives found their hands tied. Months passed. Leads came and went. Every time something looked promising, it unraveled under scrutiny. A year and a half went by. The energy behind the investigation slowed. And then, just as it seemed the case might fade into obscurity, a new voice emerged, one that no one expected. In June of 2008, 18 months after Amber Belkin's tragic death, detectives received a phone call that changed everything. The woman on the other end introduced herself as Veronica, Giovanni's wife. Her tone was quiet but firm, and what she had to say caught the detectives' full attention. Veronica explained that when her husband was first connected to the case, she didn't believe it. She had known him for years, shared a home with him, raised a family together. Nothing in his behavior ever made her suspect he was capable of anything violent or malicious. But that changed the day police arrived at their home to collect his DNA. The moment the police officers walked out of their home, something in Giovanni shifted. Veronica, his wife, immediately sensed the change in his demeanor. He turned to her, his expression stern and unreadable, and said in a tone that left no room for argument, "We need to pack. We're leaving." Veronica blinked, confused and alarmed. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice low but urgent. Without hesitation, Giovanni replied, "The police think I killed someone." Her stomach dropped. In disbelief, she asked the question that now echoed like a thunderclap in her memory. "Did you?" Giovanni looked her square in the eye, his face devoid of emotion, and said a single word that chilled her to the bone. "Yes." Veronica didn't need to ask who he was referring to. She knew. Deep down, she had already suspected the answer. The name Amber Belulin flashed through her mind like a jolt of electricity. According to Veronica, Giovanni had a long history of controlling and intimidating behavior. So when he confessed, Veronica stayed silent. She helped him pack. They relocated quickly, leaving behind their old routines and familiar surroundings. For a while, Veronica tried to convince herself that staying quiet was the only way to keep her children safe. But every day she carried the burden of what she knew and what he had done. And that burden was growing heavier by the hour. One day, in a rare, quiet moment, she found the courage to ask him again. She needed to hear it directly, without denial or confusion. "Did you kill Amber?" Giovanni didn't flinch. He told her yes, again. This time, he added more detail. According to him, it had happened during a robbery. He claimed things had gotten out of hand, that it wasn't planned, that it had been a mistake. He said it with such cold simplicity, as if it were a minor misstep and not a devastating loss of life. Veronica was stunned. She pleaded with him to go to the authorities, to do the right thing, to stop running and finally face the consequences of his actions. But Giovanni refused. He wasn't ready to give up control. He dismissed her plea, brushing it off like it was a passing suggestion. That moment changed everything for Veronica. She realized she couldn't keep living under his shadow. So she did something she had never dared to do before. She told him she wanted a divorce. She made it clear that she intended to take the kids and leave. Giovanni's response was unnerving. Instead of arguing or becoming openly hostile, he suggested they talk it through. He offered to take her out for coffee so they could discuss things calmly. It seemed like a peaceful gesture, but what happened next proved it was anything but. Instead of driving her to a cafe or a neutral place, Giovanni took a detour. He drove her out to a remote area far from traffic, buildings, or cell service. Then he locked the car doors. Veronica didn't share many details about that encounter, but it was enough to terrify her. Somehow, nothing happened that day. But the message was clear. She needed to tread very carefully. The very next morning, Giovanni dropped Veronica and their children off at her mother's house. Then he disappeared. The moment he was gone, Veronica picked up the phone and contacted the police. This time, she wasn't backing down. She handed over a full statement, revealing everything she knew. Every conversation, every confession, every threat. She knew that speaking out could put her at risk, but staying silent any longer was no longer an option. With Veronica's testimony in hand, the district attorney's office finally had what they needed. The case had dragged on for more than a year and a half, but now, with a direct confession and a credible witness, they had grounds to move forward. An arrest warrant was issued. But there was a new complication. Giovanni was gone, and no one knew exactly where he was. Investigators strongly suspected he had crossed into Mexico. That created new challenges. Capturing a fugitive across international lines required cooperation from multiple agencies. So the U.S. Marshals got involved, and Giovanni was placed on their 15 most wanted list. They reached out to Mexican authorities, requesting assistance in locating him. Weeks passed with no breakthrough. The search stretched across state lines and international borders. But finally, after nearly 6 weeks of investigation, authorities located Giovanni. He was found at a relative's house just across the U.S.-Mexico border, only a few miles from the country line. He had been lying low, hiding in plain sight. In a moment of tragic irony, when the arresting officers arrived, Giovanni was playing a video game, one of the exact same titles that had been stolen from the store on the morning of Amber's death. He was taken into custody without incident. But before he could be extradited to Texas, one critical legal agreement had to be made. Under the terms of the U.S.-Mexico extradition treaty, the United States could not seek the death penalty. If they wanted him back, prosecutors had to promise that capital punishment would not be pursued. Though the decision was difficult for Amber's family to accept, the district attorney agreed. The priority was to bring Giovanni back and ensure he faced justice. Once returned to Texas, prosecutors reviewed the case in detail and ultimately decided to offer Giovanni a plea deal. Without the death penalty as leverage, a lengthy trial might stretch on for years and still end in uncertainty. So, a deal was proposed. In exchange for a guilty plea, Giovanni would receive a life sentence with the possibility of parole after 30 years. He accepted. In court, Giovanni gave a partial confession. According to his account, he hadn't gone to the store with the intention of hurting anyone. He said he simply wanted to steal some money because he had recently lost his job and was under financial stress. He claimed that Amber complied at first, but then tried to call for help. And in that moment, he said, things escalated. But detectives weren't convinced by that narrative. For one, their records showed Giovanni had not actually lost his job. He had still been employed at another store in the same chain. And second, the idea that he hadn't planned to harm Amber didn't align with the facts. She knew him. If he had simply robbed the store, she could have easily identified him. That made it hard to believe her death was unintentional. When asked about why he hadn't turned himself in earlier, Giovanni gave vague statements about feeling guilt and wanting to prioritize other people's needs. Detectives viewed this as nothing more than an attempt to make himself seem remorseful without taking real accountability. Under the terms of his plea deal, Giovanni didn't have to disclose every detail of what happened that day. And so, some parts of the truth remain unknown, locked behind a partial confession that left as many questions as it answered. Giovanni Rivera was sent to prison, where he will remain for decades. The earliest he can even be considered for parole is in the year 2038. Whether he'll ever walk free is another story entirely. After the sentencing, Amber's parents spoke publicly. Through tears and pain, they made one thing clear. They would do everything in their power to ensure Giovanni never sees the outside of a prison again. And what about Brandon, the man who, for weeks, had been at the center of suspicion? He had spent those early days of the investigation under a dark cloud. Police treated him like a prime suspect. They interrogated his fiancée, even warning her that she might be in danger. His name was whispered in offices, questioned by friends, doubted by neighbors. He was innocent, but that didn't stop the damage. Now, with the truth revealed, Brandon's name was finally cleared. Early in the morning on March 15, 2023, Angela experienced a sudden and alarming decline in her health. She awoke feeling intensely dizzy, accompanied by severe nausea and a crippling pain in her abdomen. It quickly became evident that this was not a routine illness or passing discomfort. Something was terribly wrong. Angela realized she needed immediate medical attention. As emergency responders rushed her to the hospital, the situation became more dire. Doctors and nurses worked tirelessly, employing every measure at their disposal in an attempt to stabilize her condition. Despite the medical team's best efforts and the support of those who loved her, Angela's condition continued to deteriorate. On the afternoon of March 18, at exactly 4:29 p.m., Angela was officially pronounced dead. Tragically, she left this world without ever knowing the full story of what had happened, or the dark truth that had been lurking within the walls of her own home. Dear viewers, we appreciate your support and comments. It means a lot to us. Thank you for being with us. Angela Marie Thompson was born on a crisp spring day, April 15, 1975, in the lively town of Dodge City, Kansas, a place known for its deep roots in American frontier history. She entered the world as one of 10 children in a loving and bustling household. Surrounded by the laughter and companionship of her siblings, Angela quickly became a standout presence. Her natural charm, sharp intelligence, and gift for conversation made her not only a joy to be around, but a magnetic force at every family event, church function, or neighborhood gathering. From an early age, it was clear that Angela had a rare ability to make others feel seen, heard, and valued. Angela's heart was as generous as it was spirited. Though she suffered from allergies, her deep affection for animals was undeterred. She often volunteered at local shelters and supported wildlife preservation initiatives through charitable efforts. Books were her constant companions. Historical novels, DIY manuals, and spiritual literature lined her shelves. And she often said that reading offered her both wisdom and solace. Alongside this literary passion, She developed an unexpected talent for woodworking, creating furniture and home decor that were both functional and artistic. Her passion for design led her to study interior design formally. She saw living spaces not merely as rooms with furniture, but as places where memories were born, where comfort met functionality, and where beauty uplifted the spirit. Angela had a unique eye for transforming ordinary rooms into inviting sanctuaries, often helping friends rearrange their homes or stage spaces for life's special moments. Family remained the cornerstone of Angela's life. Whether near or far, she worked hard to stay emotionally close to her parents, siblings, and extended relatives. Her unwavering loyalty and commitment to those she loved never went unnoticed. Angela frequently served as the glue that held family bonds strong, planning reunions, organizing family history nights, and even documenting ancestral stories that otherwise might have been lost to time. Her enthusiasm for genealogy blossomed into a meaningful vocation. As a certified family history consultant, she took joy in helping others uncover their roots, bridging generations through names, stories, and rediscovered connections. Angela was also a deeply spiritual woman. Her faith guided her values and decisions. She was active in her church community, where she served in multiple capacities over the years, directing the choir with grace and enthusiasm, teaching Sunday school with compassion, and leading youth group activities that inspired and uplifted the younger generation. Her contributions were many, and her presence always carried a sense of calm, encouragement, and joy. On December 18, 1999, Angela married James Craig, a charismatic and ambitious man who was pursuing a career in dentistry. Their wedding was filled with warmth and promise, surrounded by family and friends who cheered them on with hope for a bright future. As the years unfolded, that promise began to take form. In 2006, James reached a significant milestone, earning his doctorate in dental surgery from the University of Missouri, Kansas City. Driven by his vision to give back to the dental field, James played a foundational role in helping launch an international dental program, which assisted internationally trained dentists in obtaining credentials to practice in the United States. This initiative not only broadened access to dental care, but also helped diversify the profession. By the fall of 2006, the couple relocated to Aurora, Colorado, where James established his dental practice. Over the next 2 decades, the Craig family grew and flourished. They welcomed 6 children into their lives, building a household filled with laughter, learning, and love. Angela managed the beautiful chaos of motherhood with grace and intention. She was deeply engaged in her children's lives, attending school events, volunteering at local programs, and fostering a home environment where kindness and curiosity were deeply valued. Although geography separated her from some of her siblings, Angela remained especially close to her sister Toni, who lived in Utah. The two shared a bond that went beyond blood. They spoke daily, sharing the small joys and big challenges of life, and often planned trips to spend time together in person. Their relationship served as a reminder of the power of sisterhood, anchored in trust, humor, and mutual support. By all outward appearances, life seemed full and stable for the Craig family. James's dental practice had gained a strong reputation in the community, while Angela's volunteer efforts and church leadership roles made her a well-known and respected figure. Their home in Aurora was often filled with visiting relatives, laughter, and the joyful chaos of children. However, in March of 2023, the family's world began to shift in unexpected and deeply concerning ways. On the morning of March 15, Angela experienced a sudden and severe headache, accompanied by pronounced dizziness and nausea. Alarmed, James rushed her to the hospital. What began as a precautionary visit quickly turned into a medical emergency. Despite the best efforts of the emergency team, her symptoms rapidly escalated. By 2 p.m., Angela suffered a seizure so serious that doctors placed her on life support to stabilize her. Her family, devastated and anxious, gathered around, trying to make sense of the sudden downturn. This incident marked Angela's 3rd visit to the hospital within a 10-day period. On both previous visits, she had reported similar symptoms: headaches, nausea, and dizziness. But no definitive cause had been found. The treatments were supportive, but ultimately inconclusive. Medical staff were now urgently working to identify any underlying condition that could explain the alarming progression of her symptoms. Blood tests, scans, and consults with specialists were expedited. The lack of clarity only deepened the family's concern. Two close family friends, Ryan Redfern and his wife, were quick to arrive at the hospital that day. Ryan, a fellow dentist and longtime friend of James dating back to their university years, had also become a business partner in the dental practice. When James faced financial hardship in 2021, Ryan had stepped in with both strategic advice and financial support to help stabilize the business. Ryan's wife, a highly qualified nurse with a doctorate in nursing, had been following Angela's health updates closely. As a healthcare professional and personal friend, she wanted to be present, not just out of concern, but to offer any assistance she could. Angela's symptoms had first emerged shortly after she returned from a visit to see her sister in Utah in early March. On March 5th, she began feeling unwell and sought care the next day. The initial evaluation yielded no alarming findings, and she was advised to rest. Yet by March 9th, her condition had worsened enough to warrant another trip to the hospital. Friends and family were growing increasingly uneasy. On that same day, Ryan's wife reached out to James personally. She offered her medical expertise and support, understanding how emotionally and physically exhausting such circumstances could be. James thanked her sincerely and said they were managing things for the time being. Her concern did not end there. On March 10th, she followed up, kindly checking in to see how Angela was progressing. She reiterated her willingness to help in any way possible. James, while remaining composed, admitted the situation was becoming more complex than they had anticipated. James also shared that Angela had undergone a wide range of diagnostic tests. Her blood work was comprehensive, including panels to rule out autoimmune disorders and other systemic conditions. When those tests returned normal, it offered temporary relief but no real answers. Her blood pressure was noted to be inconsistent, raising additional questions but still providing no definitive cause. The medical team continued to investigate, committed to leaving no stone unturned. Over the span of just 24 hours, Angela had been administered 5 full liters of intravenous fluids, a significant volume intended to stabilize and restore her system. Yet despite the intensity of the treatment, her blood pressure continued to hover at dangerously low levels, remaining stubbornly unresponsive to the team's medical efforts. Her condition was both perplexing and concerning. Angela herself still reported feeling deeply unwell. Fatigue clung to her like a shadow, and the nagging nausea had not subsided. She expressed persistent dizziness, an almost vertigo-like sensation that made even the simplest movements feel disorienting. The medical team, though unsure of the underlying cause, decided that it would be safest to keep her overnight. The hope was that with continued monitoring and further rest, her body might begin to stabilize and perhaps offer some clue as to what was unfolding internally. Their working theory was that Angela might simply need more time for recovery, and that the next day they could safely send her home. In the days that followed, Ryan's wife continued to check in regularly. Her concern never wavered. With her professional background in nursing, she was able to understand the complexity of Angela's symptoms on a deeper level, and she offered her insights and support without hesitation. James, trying to stay composed amid the mounting stress, shared with her that Angela had undergone even more diagnostic testing. This included an MRI, performed due to a family history of brain tumors, something the doctors didn't want to overlook. They had also conducted multiple ultrasounds and comprehensive CT scans of her head, chest, and abdomen, all in hopes of uncovering any potential abnormalities. To everyone's surprise, including the physicians, all results came back normal. There were no signs of neurological issues, no organ inflammation, no hidden infections, no cardiac abnormalities, and no structural damage that could explain her increasing discomfort. The tests painted the picture of a physically healthy woman. Yet the contrast between the clean medical reports and Angela's clear suffering could not have been more striking. Eventually, without any solid answers, Angela was discharged and allowed to return home. The physicians advised continued rest, hydration, and follow-up visits. But as her loved ones helped her out of the hospital that day, an unsettling question remained heavy in the air, one that no lab test had yet answered. If everything appeared normal on paper, why was Angela growing weaker by the day? Tragically, the reprieve was short-lived. On the morning of March 15, 2023, just days after her release, Angela's condition took a sudden and distressing turn. This time, her symptoms intensified to an alarming degree. She woke up with extreme dizziness, unbearable nausea, and an overwhelming sensation of stomach pain that left her barely able to sit upright. It became clear to her that this was no ordinary episode. She needed urgent help. James was unavailable at the time, attending to patients at his dental clinic, so Angela made a call to her brother. He immediately dropped everything and rushed over to her home. Upon arrival, he found her visibly weakened and in clear distress. Wasting no time, he transported her back to the hospital, where she was checked in around 11 a.m. James, upon learning that Angela had been admitted again and that her symptoms had worsened significantly, quickly left his clinic and made his way to the hospital. While en route, he reached out to Ryan's wife with an emotional update, informing her of Angela's condition and the urgency of the situation. In an unusual move, he even sent her 2 photographs, images of Angela lying in her hospital bed, surrounded by doctors and nurses working diligently. The atmosphere was heavy with concern and uncertainty. Before long, Angela suffered a stroke and became unresponsive. The gravity of the moment silenced the room. She was immediately placed on life support. Her family, now gathered at the hospital, was left stunned, hoping for a miracle but increasingly overwhelmed by fear. Hearing the news, Ryan and his wife decided without hesitation to visit the hospital. They wanted to be present for Angela and support the family during what was clearly a devastating time. On their way there, Ryan received an unexpected call from Caitlin, the office manager at James's dental practice. Though Caitlin had only recently been hired, she had already become familiar with the daily routines at the clinic, and she had noticed something that had been bothering her deeply. She shared with Ryan a strange incident that had taken place on March 6th, shortly after Angela's first hospital visit. Caitlin had been working late at the office when James unexpectedly walked in. This alone wasn't odd. Dentists occasionally returned after hours, but what caught her attention was his behavior. Rather than going to his private office, as he normally would, James walked down the hall and entered one of the empty exam rooms, where he used a different computer to access the internet. It struck Caitlin as peculiar. James was always predictable in his use of space and equipment, so this deviation from his routine raised questions. About half an hour after she left the building that night, Caitlin received a text message from James. In it, he explained that he was expecting a personal package to be delivered to the office sometime soon and kindly asked her to make sure it was received. He added a very specific instruction, that the package must remain unopened and that it should be given only to him. Almost a week later, on March 13th, the package James had referenced finally arrived. But there was a problem. One of the dental assistants, unaware of the instruction, had already opened it, assuming it contained medical supplies for the clinic. Caitlin, recalling James's emphasis on confidentiality, quickly resealed the package and brought it directly to him. While doing so, something caught her eye, a label bearing the words, "Hazardous Materials." The symbol was unmistakable. She was momentarily startled. It didn't seem like something typically associated with dental work. The container inside was cylindrical and oddly heavy. Still, assuming it might be a specialized dental chemical or piece of equipment, she handed it off without asking questions. But the image of that label lingered in her mind. That same afternoon, Caitlin noticed James leaving the office with the package, wrapped in brown paper and clutched tightly in his hand. Her suspicions deepened. The secrecy, the label, the odd use of the exam room computer. It all seemed strange. Later that evening, driven by curiosity and concern, Caitlin conducted a search online. She began typing in keywords related to hazardous materials, chemical labels, and related symptoms. That's when she stumbled upon something deeply unsettling. The list of symptoms associated with one particular chemical. Dizziness, persistent nausea, abdominal pain, and critically low blood pressure mirrored the exact symptoms Angela had been experiencing since early March. Now shaken, Caitlin confided everything to Ryan during that call. As Ryan processed what he had just heard, a chilling realization dawned on him. There was now a possibility, unthinkable just days earlier, that Angela's mysterious illness might not be natural in origin. When Ryan finally arrived at the hospital, he found his wife waiting for him in the intensive care wing. Angela was unconscious and on life support. The room was quiet, heavy with worry. Without wasting time, Ryan approached a nurse on duty. Speaking carefully and respectfully, he expressed a grave concern that something external, perhaps even intentionally introduced, might be contributing to Angela's rapid decline. He shared Caitlin's observations, explained the odd behavior at the office, and voiced a suspicion that, while difficult to speak aloud, now seemed impossible to ignore. Though momentarily stunned by the disturbing information shared by Ryan, the attending nurse at the hospital maintained her composure and acted with immediate professionalism. Recognizing the potential seriousness of the situation, she assured Ryan that his concerns would be taken seriously. Despite the unusual nature of the claim, she ordered a new battery of diagnostic tests on Angela, this time with a broader scope, including toxicology screening. The possibility that Angela's medical decline could be the result of external interference, not just natural illness, was no longer a theory to be ignored. But the nurse didn't stop there. Aware that what she had just heard could have significant legal and ethical implications, she quietly placed a call to emergency services. Her report was brief but pointed. A patient was exhibiting unexplained symptoms, and there was now a credible allegation suggesting the involvement of a hazardous substance. She requested immediate attention from the authorities, triggering a formal response that would soon change the course of the case. Meanwhile, outside the hospital room, James had stepped away to take a phone call. His absence gave Ryan and his wife a brief window to quietly leave the facility. They were emotionally drained, disturbed by everything that had unfolded, but also clear in their belief that more needed to be done. However, they had barely made it to the parking lot when Ryan's phone rang again, this time with James on the other end, sounding both alarmed and accusatory. James's tone was frantic. He demanded to know why Ryan had left so suddenly, and more significantly, why the hospital was now treating him as a suspect. He claimed that members of the staff had begun asking pointed questions, even implying that he might have been responsible for Angela's deteriorating health. His voice, usually calm and measured, was now laced with confusion, frustration, and desperation. Ryan didn't dodge the confrontation. Choosing honesty over diplomacy, he addressed James head-on. He asked about the suspicious package delivered to the dental office, the hazardous label on the container, and the secretive behavior Caitlin had described. He pressed James about the inconsistency between his public concern for Angela and the private behaviors that suggested something altogether different. Backed into a corner, James paused, then made a shocking admission. He confessed that he had indeed ordered the chemical in question. However, he insisted that he never intended for it to be used the way it might have been. In a bewildering twist, he claimed that Angela herself had asked him to acquire it, an explanation that to Ryan sounded implausible and inconsistent with the woman they all knew. James said he believed Angela wanted it for some personal reason, and he never imagined she would consume it or become critically ill as a result. After the tense exchange, the call ended, but the tension didn't. A few moments later, James followed up with a text message, one that would become a critical piece of the unfolding story. In it, James pleaded with Ryan not to tell anyone what he had just disclosed, especially not law enforcement. He wrote that he feared Ryan's involvement would only cause further harm to his already fragile family, and urged him to think carefully before sharing the details of their conversation. He even suggested that the entire situation might have been avoided if Ryan had approached him directly, in private, rather than going to others. There was a tone of accusation in his words, as if Ryan's decision to speak up had betrayed a personal bond. Despite the emotional weight of James's message, Ryan knew what he had to do. His instincts told him that something was seriously wrong, and time was running out. Choosing responsibility over silence, he contacted the police later that evening. He provided a detailed account of everything he had observed, heard, and been told, including James's admission, the suspicious package, and Caitlin's observations. He asked for a full investigation, making it clear that he was not acting out of malice, but out of deep concern for Angela. Shortly after midnight, long after most of the hospital had gone quiet, law enforcement officers arrived at the medical facility. Their presence was calm, but unmistakably official. They met with hospital staff and reviewed Angela's latest test results. She remained unresponsive, still on life support, with no signs of brain activity. What had begun as a baffling medical case was now evolving into a potential criminal investigation. The following morning, March 16, 2023, the investigation gained momentum. Detectives visited the dental office where James worked and spoke with Caitlin, the office manager whose sharp observations had already become central to the case. Caitlin did not hesitate. She described the events of March 6th, the morning James had prepared a protein shake for Angela before work. At the time, he had casually mentioned it at the office, presenting himself as a thoughtful husband, making sure his wife had energy to start her day. But what followed painted a troubling picture. That very same day, Angela had started to feel dizzy, a symptom that marked the beginning of her rapid health decline. Caitlin also reiterated her concerns about the package James had asked her to receive in secret. She had seen the hazardous label with her own eyes and remembered the name of the substance printed on it. A quick search had confirmed her fears. Symptoms from exposure to such a chemical included precisely what Angela had experienced: nausea, dizziness, severe abdominal pain, and dangerously low blood pressure. In some cases, it could cause loss of consciousness or worse. Ryan, who had also joined the investigators at the office that day, added context that only deepened the concern. He revealed that back in 2021, during a financially difficult period for James, the two had several long conversations about both business and personal matters. James had been open about his financial troubles and even more candid about his marital issues. According to Ryan, James had expressed serious dissatisfaction with his marriage and had even hinted at the possibility of divorce, something that had never been made public and certainly didn't align with the family's outward appearance. To gain further insight, police investigators interviewed all 6 of the Craig children. They wanted to understand Angela's mental and emotional state from those who knew her best. The responses were unified and clear. Angela had been a happy, vibrant woman. She was deeply involved in their lives, energetic, nurturing, and emotionally present. None of the children could recall anything resembling depression or erratic behavior. In fact, they were confused by any suggestion that she would have requested or consumed something dangerous. This testimony stood in stark contrast to the narrative James was beginning to offer, one that painted Angela as possibly unstable or secretive. With inconsistencies piling up, the investigation escalated. Police obtained warrants to search the Craig family's home and James's dental practice. They began carefully combing through physical evidence, computer history, and most importantly, text message records. Investigators focused their attention on James's exchanges with Angela, particularly on March 6th, the day she first reported her symptoms. The messages were telling. Early that morning, Angela had texted James, thanking him for the coffee he had made her, adding a heart emoji and expressing hope for a productive day. But within a short time, her messages changed. She began reporting that she felt lightheaded and off. In response, James advised her to monitor her blood pressure and take it easy. As the conversation continued, his messages became strangely clinical. He asked about symptoms that aligned with neurological episodes, including whether she felt numbness, muscle weakness, or confusion. He compared her symptoms to those seen in strokes and mentioned that she had taken medications in the past that made her feel similarly. Taken as a whole, the combination of text messages, Caitlin's observations, James's admission, and Angela's unexplained medical condition pointed to a deeply unsettling possibility. While investigators had yet to draw final conclusions, the threads of the case were converging toward a narrative far darker than anyone could have imagined just weeks earlier. Following the unsettling and emotionally tense exchange between James and Angela, his ongoing concern, though outwardly masked in supportive language, began to feel less like genuine worry and more like a calculated observation of cause and effect. Investigators, reading through their messages in chronological order, noted that James seemed to be tracking her symptoms with remarkable precision. He asked pointed questions, anticipated outcomes, and showed an unsettling degree of awareness about the progression of her condition, something that, in hindsight, painted a grim picture of intent rather than accident. The investigation took a crucial and irreversible turn when law enforcement obtained permission to access and inspect James's digital devices. A forensic search of his computer revealed not only 1, but 2 email accounts linked directly to him. It was within this second, more private account that investigators discovered a disturbing series of online searches related to poisoning, toxic substances, and the specific symptoms Angela had been experiencing. The search queries weren't casual or vague. They were medically detailed and consistent with someone researching how to cause, recognize, and potentially conceal the administration of a harmful substance. He had purchased a compound with a product description that clearly warned of its toxicity, noting that ingestion could be fatal. The item had been shipped to his home in discreet packaging just days before Angela's symptoms began to escalate. Even more troubling were the YouTube videos James had recently watched. The investigators uncovered a string of clips and tutorials related to chemical handling, including how certain substances affect the human body. The combination of his purchases, online searches, and video content left little room for ambiguity. The narrative forming was one of preparation, not coincidence. By this point in the investigation, the puzzle pieces were snapping into place. The timing of events, the online behavior, the testimony of concerned coworkers and family members, everything pointed to one chilling conclusion. Angela's symptoms were not the result of a mystery illness. She had been deliberately and methodically poisoned. But the burning question remained: why? Digging deeper into the motive, detectives began conducting interviews with Angela's close friends and family. Angela's sister offered a candid and deeply personal account of Angela's marriage. According to her, those closest to Angela had long known that the marriage was troubled and had been for years. She revealed that James had not only been emotionally distant, but had also engaged in multiple extramarital affairs over the course of their relationship. One especially unsettling incident stood out from 5 or 6 years earlier. Angela had confided in her sister that she was afraid of James, his temper, and the emotional manipulation she often endured behind closed doors. It was during this same period that Angela began expressing a deep desire to end the marriage. According to her sister, Angela had attempted to leave several times over the last 16 years, but was always met with carefully calculated guilt, charm, or intimidation that pulled her back in. James had a way of shifting the narrative, convincing her to stay for the sake of the children, the reputation of the family, or his own emotional state. The cracks in their marriage weren't limited to their emotional lives. James's professional world was crumbling too. His dental practice, once thriving, was facing severe financial pressure. Ryan, his longtime friend and business partner, had already stepped in once to prevent its collapse. It was later uncovered that James, desperate for money, had made multiple trips to Las Vegas to gamble. While investigators continued building their case, medical staff at the hospital did everything they could to keep Angela alive. But despite their tireless efforts, on March 18, 2023, at 4:29 p.m., Angela was officially declared dead. She passed away surrounded by loved ones, never having regained consciousness and never learning the full truth of what had transpired in the shadows of her own home. Only hours later, prosecutors moved swiftly. James Craig was formally charged with first-degree premeditated murder, and on March 19, just one day after Angela's death, he was arrested. His arrest was not a surprise to those who had followed the case closely, but it was a crushing emotional moment for Angela's children, who were now mourning the loss of one parent while watching the other face the justice system. Just days later, James made his first appearance in a Colorado courtroom. As the charges were read aloud, the courtroom filled with a mix of grief, disbelief, and anger. Friends, family, former patients, and several of his and Angela's children sat quietly, many of them in tears. The man who stood before the judge in an orange jumpsuit, wrists shackled, was unrecognizable from the charismatic dentist seen in family photos and community events. At just 45 years old, James Craig was now a man facing a lifetime behind bars. In addition to the murder charge, prosecutors added a second charge: tampering with physical evidence. His bail was set at $10 million, a sum reflective of both the gravity of the crime and the risk of flight. His trial has been scheduled for December 2024, and it is expected to be one of the most closely followed criminal cases in the state. In a final twist that added yet another layer to the motive, investigators discovered that Angela had not one, but 3 life insurance policies in her name. While it remains unconfirmed whether James intended to collect the payouts, the financial incentive added yet another dark possibility to the already disturbing portrait of deceit, infidelity, and betrayal. June 13, 1993, started off like any other quiet summer Sunday in Minneapolis, Minnesota. A maintenance worker had been sent to an apartment building to investigate complaints from a downstairs tenant. As the worker made his way to Jeannie's door, he noticed something strange, the sound of running water. Her shower had apparently been on for several hours, highly unusual. He knocked several times, but there was no response. After waiting a moment longer and receiving no answer, he decided to use his lockpick tools to enter the unit and check for a possible emergency. Nothing could have prepared him for what he saw next. The scene inside was horrific. It far exceeded anything he had imagined. Completely shocked and horrified, the worker stumbled back, fled the apartment in panic, and immediately called the police. Every crime has its own story, and we're here to tell it to you, our dear viewers. Like, comment, and subscribe. Stay with us. Jeanie Childs entered the world in 1958 in the heart of Minneapolis, Minnesota, a bustling yet often unforgiving Midwestern city where the seasons changed dramatically, and so too did the lives of those trying to make ends meet. She was born into a working-class household, the kind of family that lived modestly but with a sense of dignity rooted in perseverance. Her father worked in a local manufacturing plant, while her mother took on cleaning work and babysitting for neighbors, doing whatever she could to help stretch their limited income. Jeanie, or Jeanie as she was affectionately called by her family and close friends, grew up in an environment where love was present but life was far from easy. As one of several siblings, she had to learn early the importance of cooperation, self-reliance, and emotional strength. There were times when food had to be carefully rationed, and moments when bills were paid just in the nick of time. Yet the child's family was held together not only by shared hardships but by strong communal bonds. They were active in their church, regularly attended local potlucks, and often visited neighbors, drawing comfort from the collective strength of their community. During her early years, Jeanie was known for her spirited personality. She was vibrant, full of questions, and eager to engage with the world. But as she matured, a visible shift occurred. The weight of financial limitations and the awareness of her family's fragile economic situation began to shape her worldview. By her teenage years, Jeanie had become more inward-looking, cautious in her interactions, and quietly aware of the hurdles she would face as she transitioned into adulthood. In the 1970s, as the country faced economic turbulence and jobs became harder to come by, Jeanie stepped into adulthood without the safety nets many of her peers took for granted. She had no college fund, no access to long-term educational support, and few professional connections. Her parents, though loving, simply couldn't offer her the financial stability she needed to build a different kind of future. In response, she took on whatever work was available. These jobs were rarely consistent, and layoffs were common. When local industries began to suffer due to broader economic changes, opportunities grew scarcer. For Jeanie, it felt like she was always chasing stability that remained just out of reach. Over time, the constant stress of making ends meet took a heavy toll. She moved from one apartment to another, often unable to secure a permanent place to live. With mounting financial pressure and few meaningful support systems, Jeanie, like many women facing similar struggles, found herself in increasingly precarious situations. It was during this vulnerable period that she entered into a world of work that was not part of any long-term aspiration, but rather a desperate decision born out of limited choices. The apartment Jeanie Childs called home was as modest as the life she led. Just a single, small room tucked within a low-budget building in Minneapolis. She adorned the room with simple touches, a few framed photos of her family, secondhand furniture that had seen better days but still offered comfort, and curtains she had found at a local thrift store to soften the hard edges of her reality. Neighbors recalled her presence vividly. She was remembered as approachable, even warm, despite the heavy burdens she carried. Jeanie was the kind of person who would offer a cigarette to a neighbor without hesitation, or strike up a casual chat in the hallway, easing the tensions that often came with living in such close, chaotic quarters. She had a special concern for the younger women in the building, those who, like her, had arrived there through difficult personal journeys. Even as she lived a life marked by hardship, she never completely severed ties with her past. She called her sister regularly, maintaining their bond across the miles and years. Whenever her schedule or circumstances allowed, She would show up for family gatherings, sometimes unexpectedly, but always with genuine warmth. Her family, though worried for her, never stopped caring. Those who knew Jeanie well would often speak of her deep longing for a better life. She spoke openly about her hope to one day step away from the work she had fallen into, to overcome her addiction, and to secure a job that would bring stability. She imagined a world where she could have a small apartment of her own, a reliable routine, and maybe even return to school. But dreams, however sincere, often collided with the stark reality of systemic neglect, generational poverty, and a lack of meaningful social support. For women like Jeanie, there were few safe exit routes. The reality was not that Jeanie lacked willpower, far from it. She had strength in abundance, but strength alone does not build a bridge out of marginalization. And so she continued the only life she knew, doing her best to stay safe, finding small moments of comfort, and holding on to the hope, however fragile, that things might one day change. Her personal battles were not hers alone. They echoed the broader social landscape of the early 1990s, when American cities were gripped by the harsh policies of the so-called war on illicit substances. At that time, Jeanie was 35 years old. She was a very strong but deeply vulnerable woman. Her sister would later describe her not by her circumstances, but by her essence. Jeanie was someone with a big heart. She always wanted the best, not just for herself, but for others too. She cared, even when she was the one who needed care the most. June 13, 1993, dawned like so many warm summer Sundays in Minneapolis. The heat carried a restlessness that buzzed in the air. The city was beginning to stir. Neighbors swept sidewalks, children rode their bikes through alleyways, and radios echoed from open windows. Life moved with its usual pace in the neighborhoods around Pleasant Avenue, a residential street lined with red brick buildings and blooming trees. In apartment 202 of one such building, however, there was stillness, and soon that stillness would begin to feel out of place. Throughout the morning, residents on the lower floor began to notice something odd. Water was leaking through their ceiling, slow but steady. At first, they assumed it was an ordinary plumbing issue. Such things weren't uncommon in older buildings, especially in the heat of summer when pipes and fixtures often gave way. Around midday, a maintenance worker was called to investigate the leak. These kinds of service calls were routine. He likely expected a broken faucet or an overflowing toilet. But as he approached the second-floor apartment from which the leak appeared to be coming, he noticed something unsettling. From behind the door of apartment 202, there was only silence. No footsteps, no voices, just the low sound of running water that had seemingly been on for hours. The worker knocked several times, giving enough time for someone inside to respond. He paused and knocked again, louder this time, calling out Jeanie's name. Still, no reply. Although he had no reason yet to assume the worst, a growing sense of unease settled over him. He tried the door. It was locked. Following building protocol, and given the concern over potential flooding, he used his service key to slowly unlock and open the door. What he found inside was unlike anything he had ever encountered. The repairman recoiled in horror and immediately called the police. Officers from the Minneapolis Police Department arrived within minutes, cordoned off the scene, and began what has become one of the city's most famous homicide investigations. For the investigators who entered the apartment, the crime scene was unforgettable. Experienced detectives, some of whom have years of experience, later described it as one of the most violent and horrific scenes they had ever encountered. Investigators quickly identified the victim as 35-year-old Jeanie Childs, a well-known resident of the building. Police interviewed neighbors, some of whom said they had heard the sounds of a struggle the night before, although none of them had called police at the time. Others mentioned seeing strange men coming and going from Jeanie's apartment in the days leading up to her death, but the descriptions were vague and there were no obvious suspects. The apartment itself was a mess because of Jeanie's lifestyle, traces of use, personal belongings scattered on surfaces. Police collected physical evidence, including fingerprints, DNA samples, and items containing what they believe is the suspect's DNA. However, despite the abundance of forensic materials, technology was limited at the time. In 1993, DNA testing was still in its early stages, and there was no way to match unknown samples to a national database. Investigators collected evidence, took notes, and hoped that traditional detective work, interviews, informants, street evidence would lead them to the killer. But as the days turned into weeks, no reliable leads emerged. Jeannie's lifestyle complicated the investigation. Potential witnesses did not dare to testify, fearing retribution or exposure. Moreover, the Minneapolis Police Department struggled with high crime rates and limited resources, forcing investigators to juggle multiple cases at once. However, the murder of the Jeanie haunted the detectives assigned to investigate him. What set him apart was the sheer brutality of the attack. This was not a failed robbery or an accidental act of violence. It was a deliberate, insane murder. Investigators believe the killer spent some time in the apartment after the murder, moving, possibly grooming himself, leaving traces. If you left the shower on, it was either panic or a calculated attempt to destroy evidence. In any case, the crime scene was full of evidence, but without the right tools to handle it, the case came to a standstill. For the Jeanie family, the wait was excruciating. They continued to live their lives, knowing that her killer was still at large, that justice had not been served, and that over time the outcome had become even more unlikely. As anniversaries passed, they cherished memories, photos, letters, shared moments, and tried to keep her name alive even as the world moved on. However, as forensic science continued to evolve, so did the techniques that investigators use to find long-dormant leads. Units for investigating unsolved cases have appeared, focused specifically on re-examining old evidence with the help of new tools. And in Minneapolis, the murder of Jeanie Childs remained on the list of cases awaiting retrial. The discovery of Jeanie in June 1993 marked the beginning of a years-long search for answers. A search that would eventually cross state lines using cutting-edge technology and challenge the limits of what law enforcement could achieve, leaving behind a scene of unimaginable violence and a forever changed family. During the investigation, investigative genealogy was used. This approach, virtually unknown to the public just a few years ago, has now become a watershed moment in solving unsolved cases, bringing hope to situations that have long seemed intractable. Investigative genealogy works by identifying partial genetic matches between DNA from crime scenes and people who have submitted their DNA to public databases. These matches can be distant relatives, or even more distant relatives. But with careful analysis, genealogists can build a family tree that narrows the field of potential suspects. Working with private forensics firms specializing in genetic genealogy, investigators sent a DNA profile to GED Match in search of partial matches. The process was painstaking and time-consuming. Genealogists studied potential relatives, studied public records, traced family lines, and gradually built a network of connections. Through this painstaking work, they were able to narrow down their focus to a few people whose genetic profiles indicated a close connection to an unknown suspect. And now, in 2019, nearly 26 years later, the world finally knows the identity of Jeanie Childs' killer. Jerry Lynn Westrom, a businessman, husband, and father from Minnesota who has lived in the public eye for decades. Arrested, accused, convicted. One name quickly rose to the top: Jerry Westrom. Westrom had never had a criminal record before, and his DNA was not in any criminal databases. Without the use of genetic genealogy, investigators would not have been able to identify him. But genealogical analysis helped a lot. Investigators placed him in the center of a family tree built on DNA matches, making him the most likely candidate. At this point, however, investigators needed a corroborating sample that would definitively link Westrom's DNA to evidence from the crime scene. This led to one of the highlights of the investigation. Surveillance teams followed Westrom in public, waiting for an opportunity to collect a discarded DNA sample. At a hockey game in Minneapolis, they saw him eating a hot dog, wiping his mouth with a napkin and throwing the napkin in the trash. This seemingly mundane act gave investigators the breakthrough they needed. The tissue was extracted, tested, and found to match the DNA profile from Jeanie Childs' apartment. The use of discarded items to collect DNA is a legally complex area but has been upheld in U.S. courts. Once a person disposes of an item in a public place, They are effectively waiving any reasonable expectation of confidentiality regarding the biological material they have left behind. This legal principle allowed investigators to obtain Westrum's DNA without his knowledge or consent, ensuring that the investigation could continue without his warning. Once the match was confirmed, law enforcement acted quickly. The evidence was compelling, and the risk of evidence slipping away or being destroyed is high. In February 2019, police arrested Westrum at his home, issued a search warrant for his property, and began preparing the case for prosecution. The arrest made national headlines both because of the brutality of the crime and the advanced forensic techniques used to solve it. In the case of Children of the Jeanie, the use of genetic genealogy has yielded answers that have eluded researchers for more than 2 decades. This connected the dots between the unknown DNA profile and the suspect, who had managed to evade detection for years. And it was a kind of completion for a family that had waited too long for justice. For the Jeanie family, the revelation of the killer's identity was both shocking and bittersweet. They were stunned to learn that the person responsible for this had lived so openly, so normally, for so many years. They were grateful to the investigators and scientists who worked tirelessly to see the case through. But they were also reminded of all the lost time. Birthdays, anniversaries, moments of mourning that dragged on unanswered. For law enforcement, the case highlighted the importance of perseverance and innovation. Investigators who worked on the case in the 1990s were acquitted, knowing that the evidence they had carefully stored would eventually be used to bring justice to justice. Young detectives newly assigned to the Unsolved Cases Unit saw in the Childs case a model of what can be achieved when science and determination come together. In the courtroom, DNA evidence became the cornerstone of the prosecution. It wasn't the only evidence. There were also footprints, historical records, and patterns of behavior. But genetic coincidence was the element that tied it all together. He turned a number of suspicions into a formal indictment, setting the stage for a subsequent trial. As the trial approached, the community was closely following what was happening. Many have been fascinated by science, intrigued by the idea that a tiny piece of genetic material could stretch over decades to identify a killer. Others were more focused on the human dimension, reflecting on the lives of Jeannie's children and the long struggles her family endured. Together, these threads weave together a deeply modern and deeply human narrative, a story of loss and, ultimately, the search for justice. Jerry Westrum's arrest in February 2019 didn't end the story. In many ways, it marked the beginning of a new chapter that will test the strength of the evidence, the reach of the legal system, and the resilience of a family and community that has waited nearly 26 years to be held accountable. For the Jeanie Childs family, Westrum's arrest was a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and hope. On the one hand, they were grateful that after decades of silence, someone had been identified and blamed. On the other hand, they were painfully aware that no legal outcome could restore what had been lost. Jeannie was gone, her life was brutally taken, and nothing that happened in court could bring her back. For them, justice was not about restoration, but about recognition, responsibility, and confidence that the person who killed her would not go unpunished. The trial began almost immediately after Westrum's arrest. The Hennepin County District Attorney's Office filed first- and second-degree murder charges, alleging that Westrum entered Jeannie's apartment on the night of June 13, 1993. They disputed that the DNA evidence left no room for doubt. Westrum's genetic material was found not only on a blanket and objects next to the victim's body, but also mixed with Jeannie's own DNA, indicating direct physical involvement in the crime. From the beginning, Westrum insisted on his innocence. His defense, consisting of experienced criminal defense attorneys, quickly prepared a counterargument. They argued that the presence of his DNA at the crime scene did not prove murder. They speculated that Westrum may have had previous contact with Jeannie unrelated to the night of her death. They drew attention to the lack of direct witness testimony, the lack of physical evidence to identify him at the scene of the crime at the time of the crime, as well as the passage of time, which, in their view, undermined the credibility of other evidence. The prosecution, however, believed that they had irrefutable evidence. In addition to the DNA match, they pointed to footprints found at the crime scene, which forensic examinations showed matched the size and pattern of Westrum's legs. They also drew attention to Westrum's story. Although he had no convictions for crimes, investigators found a pattern of behavior that they believed fit the profile of a person capable of extreme violence in certain circumstances. The preparation for the trial was long and difficult. Both parties were involved in extensive pretrial motions, discussing what evidence would be admissible, what expert testimony would be allowed, and how jurors would be instructed to interpret scientific evidence. These legal maneuvers were decisive because the case relied heavily on forensic evidence. The reliability of the family tree, the interpretation of DNA matches, and the broader question of what constitutes beyond reasonable doubt evidence in a case that modern science decides. For decades after the brutal murder of Jeanie Childs in her Minneapolis apartment, the case remained in limbo, remaining a painful and unsolved chapter in the city's criminal history. Investigators working at the crime scene in June 1993 knew they were dealing with a crime of extraordinary brutality. Despite collecting biological evidence at the time, the tools available in the 1990s did not offer a clear path to identifying her killer. Years passed, and the case turned into a closed one. From time to time, new detectives were appointed to check this. The evidence was periodically checked and reviewed. But the evidence dried up, witnesses passed or passed away, and the collective memory of the crime faded. For the Jeanie family, each past year has brought new grief and disappointment, a sense that justice may never come, that her name will remain associated not with a clue, but with a painful mystery. By the end of the 2010s, this approach was gaining popularity. High-profile cases that were once considered unsolvable have begun to unravel, sometimes at astonishing speed. Investigators have begun to go back to the decade-old files, sifting through evidence that has been lying in vaults for years, in the hope that science can now provide a breakthrough that cannot be achieved by human search alone. The case of Jeanie Childs, carefully preserved in the evidence archives, was one such case. Biological material collected at the crime scene in 1993 was preserved, and it was still suitable for extended DNA analysis. Detectives working in partnership with genetic genealogists sent a sample to a public genealogy platform in search of any distant family ties that might arise. The process was painstaking and complex. Genealogists traced family trees, compared genetic markers, examined public records, and narrowed down potential people who might be associated with an unknown DNA profile. Investigators worked meticulously, keeping legal and ethical issues in mind, and were prepared to proceed with caution once they identified a potential suspect. But even as these scientific breakthroughs unfolded, the Jeanie family didn't know the details. For them, this case remained persecution, a crime that deprived them of a sister, a daughter, and a friend. A wound that never healed. Each year brought another anniversary, another reflection on the life she could have lived, another reminder of the questions that had gone unanswered for too long. At the same time, legal teams were preparing for what could be a landmark case, anticipating legal battles over the admissibility of genetic genealogy, the integrity of evidence collected decades ago, and broader ethical debates about privacy, consent, and the role of science in criminal justice. Both the prosecution and the defense have been preparing legal strategies, quietly preparing for a confrontation that could redefine what it means to solve an unsolved case in the 19th century. The public remained in the dark about the momentous event. Reporters occasionally returned to Jeanie's story in special reports or anniversary articles, but there were no dramatic headlines, no public evidence, and there was no sense that a decision was just around the corner. Even in police circles, only a small group of investigators knew that the breakthrough they had long hoped for could soon become a reality. This was followed by a methodical process of confirming the evidence. Investigators conducted covert surveillance, waited for an opportunity to collect a legally acceptable DNA sample, and painstakingly double-checked their findings. In the background, forensic experts prepared detailed reports. Prosecutors wrote legal memoranda, and court staff worked quietly to ensure that every step met the standards of justice. All of this work has led to one defining moment, the culmination of years of disillusionment with research and technological innovation. For the Jeanie family, for the city of Minneapolis, and for law enforcement and forensic experts in general, this was a fateful moment. It was not only the long-awaited exposure of the killer, but also proof that even after decades of silence, justice can still find its voice. Prosecutors, led by experienced murder lawyers, stubbornly resisted. They noted that the U.S. legal system has long considered items discarded in public places, including trash, to be legitimate loot for collection and analysis. They noted that genetic genealogy is increasingly being accepted in courts across the country, including in the high-profile conviction of a Golden State Killer in California. Importantly, they stressed that the definitive DNA match was not obtained by genealogical inference, but by direct laboratory comparison of DNA from the crime scene and biological material from Westrom. The preliminary hearings were exhaustive. Expert witnesses were called to explain the principles of genetic genealogy, the chain of evidence, and the protocols that had to be followed to ensure the integrity of the forensic process. The judges reviewed judicial precedents, weighed constitutional concerns, and ultimately ruled that the evidence was admissible. These decisions paved the way for a full-fledged jury trial. The selection of the jury was not easy. Given the high-profile nature of the case and the intense media coverage of the use of genetic genealogy, both the defense and the prosecution worked diligently to identify jurors who could approach the evidence impartially. Potential jurors were asked about their familiarity with DNA evidence, their views on privacy, and their understanding of reasonable doubt. After a thorough check, the jury sat down, and the trial officially began. The accusation began with a simple but powerful narrative. In June 1993, Jerry Westrom murdered Jeanie Childs in her apartment, leaving behind a chaotic crime scene. The evidence collected at the time, including biological material, was preserved and eventually matched to Westrom using advanced forensic techniques. The DNA match was presented as the linchpin of the case, supported by corroborating physical evidence, expert testimony, and a chronology of actions. The defense, meanwhile, tried to establish reasonable doubts. They acknowledged that Westrom's DNA was present, but argued that this did not necessarily indicate that he was at the scene of the crime at the time of the murder. They put forward alternative theories. Perhaps Westrom made love by mutual consent to Jeanie before her death. Perhaps the DNA evidence has been distorted or misinterpreted. Perhaps the focus on forensic evidence blinded investigators to other, more likely suspects. Witnesses included forensic experts, law enforcement officers who worked on the case in the 1990 and 2010, genetic genealogists, and members of the Jeanie family. Each of them was a piece of the puzzle, reconstructing the events of that night, the investigation, and the breakthrough that eventually led to Westrom's arrest. One of the key tasks of the prosecution was to translate complex scientific evidence into a language understandable to the jury. DNA evidence, while often considered conclusive, is inherently technical. Prosecutors worked carefully with experts to explain the principles of DNA matching, statistical probabilities, and steps taken to prevent contamination or error. Visual aids, diagrams, and simplified explanations were used to help jurors understand the meaning of evidence without overloading it with jargon. The defense cross-examined these experts, carefully examining the inconsistencies, challenging the assumptions, and emphasizing the novelty of the investigation methods used. They sought to remind jurors that science, despite its power, is not infallible, that every laboratory process has the right to error, and that every research tool, no matter how advanced, must be scrutinized. Throughout the trial, there was considerable tension in the courtroom. Reporters filled the ranks of the press. Family members of both the victim and the accused sat quietly, listening attentively. Public interest was high, fueled by a widespread discussion about genetic privacy and the growing role of DNA in criminal justice. The last arguments unsettled the case. The prosecution called on the jury to consider the weight of the evidence. DNA match, physical evidence, time frame, lack of any credible alternative suspect. They painted a picture of a man who had eluded justice for decades, but was eventually exposed by science. The defense, for its part, challenged the prosecution's version at every step. They interviewed forensic experts, questioning the methods used and identifying the possibility of laboratory error or contamination. They argued that reliance on genetic genealogy raises ethical questions and suggested that the novelty of the method introduces an unacceptable level of uncertainty. They reminded the jury that no one had seen Westrom at the crime scene. No murder weapon had been found, and the crime had remained unsolved for so long precisely because the initial investigation had failed to find concrete evidence. During the trial, the jury listened attentively. They were shown photographs from the crime scene, listened to hours of technical testimony, and listened to emotional statements from survivors of the Jeanie family. While the science was compelling, the human factor was no less powerful. Jurors were reminded that at the center of the case was a young woman who had been brutally murdered, and a family who had been denied justice for too long. The latter arguments crystallized the rates. The prosecution urged the jury to focus on the weight of the forensic evidence, arguing that the DNA match is conclusive and that Westrum's defense is nothing more than speculation. The defense, by contrast, cautioned against relying too heavily on scientific evidence without corroboration of facts, suggesting that the prosecution was built on probabilities rather than certainty. The jury deliberated for only 2 hours, which is surprisingly short, given the complexity and length of the trial. When they returned with the verdict, a tense silence reigned in the courtroom. The brigadier stood up and pronounced a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder and second-degree murder. For the Jeanie family, the verdict was a moment of deep, complex emotion. Of course, there was relief that the man they believed to be the perpetrator of their sister's murder was brought to trial. There was gratitude to the investigators, prosecutors, and forensic experts who worked tirelessly to bring this case to an end. But there was also a sadness, a deep and enduring sadness for the years lost, the missed opportunities, and the lives that had been so cruelly cut short. Jerry Westrum was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, which is the maximum penalty under Minnesota law for first-degree murder. He had been led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, and now his future was determined by the cold, hard walls of the prison cell. This case was a milestone for the legal system, a testament to the power of forensics, the importance of preserving evidence, and the continued commitment of law enforcement to solving even the most complex cases. And it gave hope to the families of other victims, reminding them that no matter how many years have passed, the quest for accountability never ends.